coming on the air with a lot of moving pieces out of Michigan, where there are developments even in just the last couple minutes because the parents of the suspect in Tuesday's horrific school shooting apparently aren't in town. And that's kind of a problem because they were supposed to be in court tonight to be arraigned on manslaughter charges. Those new charges against the parents coming after the prosecutor laid out some, frankly, really disturbing details about what they did and said on the morning of the shooting. We're going to go live to Oakland County on that, and you'll hear some of my one-on-one with the sheriff there on whether they could have done more to keep an eye on those parents. Plus, we're live on Omicron with that COVID variant now in at least 8 states across the U.S. And no pattern here, right? It's coast to coast. We'll talk about the prediction from one top health expert about what we'll see next and why we all need to stay calm about the whole thing. And lots of cities in the U.S. have had a spike in homicides this year. We're going to take you to one of them, Philly, where families say the violence is hitting the city's black community especially hard. And the battle over books, most of them LGBTQ plus related, with parents in one state saying they're too explicit, but that the gay and lesbian tie-in is simply a coincidence. What their chances are in this case is they go after the school district. Plus, don't tell mom to throw out those old boxes in the garage just yet. Those old baseball or Pokemon cards you have, they're back in style, and the payoffs could be pretty nice. Hey, I'm Hallie. They were charged, then they went missing, and now the lawyer for the parents of the suspected school shooter tells NBC News they left town the night of the shooting earlier this week for their own safety, but that they're on their way back to be arraigned on manslaughter charges. This is after the police sent U.S. Marshals, sent the FBI out searching for them in this manhunt, even sent out pictures of the car they were driving and of the parents themselves, James and Jennifer Crumbley, who were, again, they were supposed to turn themselves in today. The sheriff's office says there was an agreement that their attorney got in touch to say she'd arrange for their arrest if there were charges. And then she couldn't get in touch with them after that. No calls, no texts, once the charges were actually announced. I spoke with the sheriff not too long ago in Oakland County. And he told me that if his officers had had any kind of heads up that charges were coming down the pike, he would have had those parents under surveillance. Watch. So when did you find out about those charges?
We actually began to get some calls in the morning about a press conference, and that was the first we heard a press conference was happening or charges were going to be discussed.
Some calls from the prosecutor or some calls from reporters?
Reporters.
So the prosecution didn't give you a heads up that they're about to charge these two with 4 counts of manslaughter?
No, ma'am.
Is that frustrating for you?
That's an understatement.
I want to get to Shaq Brewster, who is following all of this on the ground for us. Shaq, I meant it when I said it at the top of the show that developments are coming in, like literally as I was walking into the studio here. What is the latest? Where are these parents? Do we know?
Well, Hallie, I'll tell you, there was a development that we just learned in the past couple of seconds here, and it was from the sheriff's office, the undersheriff, saying that they still have not been in contact with the attorneys of these 2 suspects who they can't get in contact with. We mentioned, and you went through the timeline of how the attorneys for this couple said that they reached out to the sheriff earlier in the day, actually yesterday, saying that when those charging decisions were made, they would turn themselves in and set up those arrangements for that to happen. Well, they didn't show up this afternoon. The sheriff says that they've lost contact, and now they're still confirming that despite the attorneys saying that the couple are on their way back at this point, the sheriff is saying they have not heard that outside of any media reports right now. So, Hallie, it's a mess. A lot's going on right now. We don't clearly know what exactly each side knows, but it seems like each side is listening to reports of what the other side is saying, and right now they still don't know exactly where this couple is at this point.
Okay, I want to come back to this, but I have to. We can't go much further here without laying out the reasons why the prosecution has charged these parents, again, the parents of the suspected shooter in that horrific attack on Tuesday, right? 4 students killed, 7 other people were hurt. And now the prosecution is giving more details about this meeting, right, that was held at the school between the parents, the student, and school officials. Talk us through those details and why these charges are in place.
Yeah, and you heard from the prosecutor. If I were just to sum up her entire press conference, it's the idea that the actions of the parents were different. They were the only ones, in her words, who knew that there was concern about this 15-year-old student, who knew that he had fantasies or thoughts about an active shooting, and then who knew that he had access to a weapon. And they knew he had access to a weapon because that weapon was purchased a week ago, and he was there as that gun was being purchased. So she's saying they were the only ones who knew that. She said their inaction on doing anything about that is criminal, and that's what makes this different. Listen to how she says this is a little bit different in terms of why, in her explanation of why these charges came about.
This doesn't just impact me as a prosecutor and a lawyer, it impacts me as a mother. The notion that a parent could read those words and also know that their son had access to a deadly weapon that they gave him is unconscionable, and I think it's criminal. It is criminal.
Now, that note that she's referencing right there, Hallie, that is what was the meeting that happened hours before the shooting, where a teacher saw a drawing, essentially, of him depicting shooting another student. There was blood based on the description that the prosecutor made. That led to him being called down to the office and his parents then being called in. But eventually, after that meeting, officials said that he needed to have some sort of counseling within 48 hours, but they let him go back to the classroom, and it's not clear that there was any search that took place of his bag or anything of that sort. So that is what she believes is criminal, that they knew he had access to a weapon that was not locked away.
Yeah.
The weapon that was purchased, that gun, was considered his Christmas gift, and that despite the depictions that were there and that were flagged by a second teacher as being disturbing, no action was taken.
And there was even in fact a text message, one of several that I know is getting a lot of attention tonight. Tell us about it.
Yeah, it was a text message that happened after the shooting, one of the first text messages after word of the shooting happened, and it was from the suspect's mother to the suspect, and it said, "Ethan, don't do it." And, you know, I'll tell you, out of all the time that we've been spending here, so many of the other messages that we've been talking about with parents, between parents and students around that time, were, "I love you, be safe,
right.
Let me know when we can see each other again." But for her, and for this instance, it was "don't do it," and that is something that the prosecutor believes is telling, and that got a lot of focus here.
You know, on that point, Jack, I think it's important as we do on this show, because even with all this breaking news, even with all the developments that are happening, like literally as we speak, I think there's a tendency to lean into that, right? There are 4 students who are dead this week. There are 4 families who are planning funerals for kids that they sent off to school and who did not come home. Talk to me more. And I think it's important that you bring up the point that there are other parents in this community who were texting their kids saying, "I love you," who were praying to God that their kids were not among the victims here. Right. What else are we hearing from these families of these 4 kids?
Yeah, and you mentioned those funerals are going to be happening in the next couple of days. We heard that from the superintendent just yesterday when he posted a video for the first time to YouTube, I believe it was. But we got a statement from the family of Justin Schilling. He was the 4th victim, 17 years old, who we learned about, who passed on Wednesday. And that statement, I want to put it up on the screen there. It says, "As a family, we would like to appeal to the public to keep the importance of what has been lost here in the forefront of our minds in the news. These are beautiful children. Their lives were full of potential with the expectation of so much more to come." And I think you underscore it. The 4 people who have been lost, they were all students between the ages of 14 and 17. Some were looking ahead to college already. Others were athletes and scholars. There are people who were lost and souls that were lost. And this is a community that is still mourning that, and also praying for the 2 to 3 people who are still in the hospital now recovering from their wounds from this attack that happened now almost a week ago, but on Tuesday. You know,
and one of the things that I asked the sheriff about, Shaq, when I talked to him really just about an hour and change ago as this search for the parents was going on, was about his, you heard his frustration there at the top of the show, but also, you know, the immense amount of resources that have been devoted now to this search after the initial attack, and the way that the community is now dealing with this other blow, right? Looking for accountability here. And there's still this question mark of where these parents who have been charged with manslaughter are. What happens here, right? Let's assume, Shaq, that they do. Let's assume that what the attorneys are saying, that the police apparently haven't heard from the attorneys directly, is accurate, and that these parents, you see them here, are coming back to town to be arraigned. Like, on the East Coast, isn't court closed? Like, what is the process here? Do we know what's going to happen moving forward?
That is somewhat of an open question because we don't know. We don't know where they are. We don't know if they've returned to the state. We don't know if they were in the state when we saw them in court a couple of days ago when it was the arraignment of that 15-year-old suspect. So there's so much that we just don't know about the process. And if they do come back tonight, where will they turn themselves in? We've been texting with their attorneys, and that's how we got the statement from their attorneys that's denying the idea that they're fleeing. But they're not giving many more details in terms of when they will arrive back and when this process will continue. And it just adds to the frustration. It adds to the tension that this community is feeling. And that doesn't even touch into the idea that there's been so many copycat attacks that the Sheriff's Department and the local law enforcement have been having to deal with. Threats of those attacks, I should say.
Shaq Brewster, I know that you are staying close to that camera, my friend, because if we get any developments while we're on the air, we're going to ask you to bring them to us live. Thank you, pal. I really appreciate your time. I want to turn to Glenn Kirschner now, a former federal prosecutor. All right, Glenn, have you seen something like this, right? Is it not, listen, the attorneys for these parents are saying they feared for their safety, so they left the night of the shooting, and now they're coming back for the arraignment. But help me understand this. I'm not, obviously, an attorney. You are. Would an arraignment not have been scheduled unless there was some kind of agreement among law enforcement, among the prosecution, among the attorneys here, that these people were going to show up?
Yeah, Hallie, ordinarily we don't schedule any court hearings just hoping that the defendants will show up. Usually the defendants have been arrested, booked, and have been put on specific notice of the date and time to appear for their arraignment if they're not detained pending that arraignment. So I can tell you the way prosecutors look at flight by people who are wanted or who are supposed to appear in court. Flight equals consciousness of guilt. Now, the devil's in the details, because when a defense attorney is in the chain of information that's going back and forth between the authorities and the clients or the defendants, it gets difficult to prove precisely what messages were being transmitted, what might enjoy attorney-client privilege, and what might not. But I'll tell you, if the prosecutors can prove that the defendants, James and Jennifer Crumley, knew they were supposed to be at court for their arraignment at a particular time and they fled, they failed to appear, that will try to be introduced at their trial ultimately as consciousness of guilt evidence. Yeah, and the arraignment was, just to be clear, it was supposed to be over an hour ago. Obviously, that hasn't happened yet. You know, Glenn, I think there have been some questions that have come up about how you even lose sight of these parents in the first place. And I think what we heard at the top of the broadcast from my interview with the sheriff is he said, I didn't even know these charges were coming down the pike, essentially. Are you surprised by that sort of what appears to be, as the sheriff characterized it to me, a miscommunication? You know, I am surprised, particularly because when there are really challenging or unusual homicide cases or homicide charges to be brought, I can tell you when I was chief of homicide at the Washington, D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, we coordinated closely, virtually minute by minute, with the Metropolitan Police Department, and we were always on the same page, because the prosecutors can charge, but only law enforcement can actually, arrest somebody and bring them to court if need be. So it is a surprise that there's miscommunication, because usually, Hallie, the police are the ones out front pushing for the arrest, and sometimes the prosecutors are pushing back to make sure they have enough evidence to charge. It's the appropriate charge to bring, particularly in the highly unusual circumstances of charging the parents of the shooter, as opposed to just the actual shooter. That's actually exactly what I wanted to ask you about next. You describe it as highly unusual to charge the parents here, and it is. But then you heard the prosecutor lay out the facts of the case that we went over with Shaq Brewster, with the texts and the discussions, and the parents having the son go back into school even after that meeting where these very disturbing and concerning drawings were brought up. Yeah, so it is unusual, but here's the thing. To charge somebody with involuntary manslaughter in a case involving a shooting death, you don't necessarily have to prove that that person pulled the trigger. Involuntary manslaughter is essentially a circumstance where you engage in conduct that is grossly negligent or reckless. And your grossly negligent or reckless conduct poses a substantial risk of death or serious bodily injury to another. and death is thereby the result. So you don't have to have pulled the trigger. If the parents give the gun to a troubled young man, as the picture is emerging, Ethan Crumbley was, and they know that they are creating a circumstance that is reasonably likely to result in death or serious bodily injury to another, then they can be charged because the law deems that they are part of the cause of death. And I'll tell you, Hallie, when I was reading through some of the text messages, for example, when teachers at the school were so concerned because they had information that Ethan Crumbley was searching for ammunition, they reach out to the parents, and Crumbley's mother texts, LOL, I'm not mad at you. You just have to make sure you don't get caught. I mean, that really screams out the kind of gross negligence or recklessness that could result in death or serious bodily injury to another once they put a gun in the hands of their troubled son and then seem to make light of the danger. So I am glad Prosecutor McDonald jumped out and brought these charges. It just would have been ideal if there had been coordination between the prosecutor's office and the law enforcement agents who are working the case.
Glenn, I have literally 10 seconds. I know this is such an annoying, broadcast news question to say, give me this in a sentence. School's responsibility here. Are they culpable? Because some of these details sort of gave more information about what the school did or did not do.
Well, it certainly seems like the school officials and teachers tried to reach out and address the situation. Okay. But when it comes to civil liability, Hallie, the devil's in the details. We have to see what they did, what they didn't do, whether they were negligent or reckless in the way they addressed this situation.
Glenn Kirschner, so glad to have you with us with your expertise. Really appreciate that context. Thanks. Turning now to a couple of the other big headlines happening today. The economy, we'll talk about the pandemic later, too. That's another big one. But it's really a mixed message with this November jobs report out today. Only 210,000 jobs created last month, which sounds pretty decent, right? Sounds like a lot. It's kind of a big miss. Economists had predicted something like 550,000 plus, right? Here's the thing. The unemployment rate did fall to 4.2% from 4.6%. That's the lowest unemployment rate since the start of the pandemic. And so President Biden took a real glass half full approach, focusing on that piece of it, how this is the fastest unemployment drop in a single year that any president has had. Stephanie Ruhle is here to get into this with us. Steph, it's so good to see you. Thank you for being up late with us here on the show. Listen, glass half full, glass half empty, right? Kind of depends how you see it, but no matter how you, to mix metaphors, slice it, the jobs report was still a miss today.
I'm going glass half full on this. Here's why. Even though that 210,000 number sounds low, look back. Over the last few months, every time we get that top line jobs number, wait a week, 2 weeks, the BLS, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, has to revise those numbers. And over the last few months, those numbers have gone up consistently. And you might say, why? Why? That makes absolutely no sense. Well, remember, in order for them to collect this data, we're living in a period of COVID. It's taking longer for this kind of information to get reported. So talk to economists across the board, those who aren't politically charged on one side or another, and they will say most likely we're going to get revisions on this number and it will be up much closer to that 500,000 number that people were predicting. And then I turn to the glass half full part that the president was talking about. And that's the other survey that showed unemployment has now ticked down while there are more Americans on the job at work than we've seen since pre-pandemic. That is a very positive economic picture in terms of jobs.
Okay, but one of the things that we've talked about this week, right, is sort of the roller coaster in the market, inflation, the expectation that maybe the Fed is going to hike interest rate next year because of some of the numbers that we're seeing. How do you put the jobs report into context of that, Steph? Are you rubbing your hands together in anticipation of this answer?
I am, because you've given me so much to cook with right here, Hallie. Markets, inflation. Okay, so let's just break it down, right? So the markets. Why did the markets drop? The markets dropped for a few reasons. Remember, we have the new COVID variant. That naturally would spook the markets. Remember back in the summer when we got the Delta variant, suddenly people were going out less. They weren't feeling so comfortable going back to work. And the markets are concerned about that. But separately, We saw the Fed chair, Jay Powell, finally say that inflation isn't transitory, meaning we're going to be stuck with it for a while. Thank you. We have been waiting for him to say that. And the one way that the government can address that is to raise interest rates. Now, the market and a lot of people freak out going like, oh, my gosh, what am I going to do? Interest rates are going to be so high. Take a breath, sister. Interest rates are currently at 0. If rates then went to 1% or 2%, that would not be high. The last time inflation was this high, rates were over 5%. Ask your parents, ask your aunt and uncle, where were interest rates when they were buying houses in the 80s, and it would blow your mind. So yes, if we saw rates go up, it would likely cool the economy a bit, and that might be a good thing given what's happening with inflation.
Steph Ruhle, I'm going to needle point you a pillow that says, take a breath, sister, because, listen, it's a good mantra. Appreciate you. Thank you for being with us on a Friday night. Thanks.
Take a breath, sister.
Speaking of taking a breath, right, this is kind of the advice from health officials when it comes to the Omicron variant. We're now seeing it in more and more states, at least 8 of them, at least so far, at least as of now, that are investigating cases of Omicron. That's probably going to go up. It's been going up all day, right? We've been seeing so much about this discussion in this country, right? This back and forth, these arguments over how our kids learn in schools. We saw that even in politics, right, with some of those governor's races from the last election. We're also seeing it in school boards and in court. We're looking at one county in particular, Wake County, North Carolina, because parents there have filed a criminal complaint against the biggest school district in the state. Why? They say the district is giving students access to books that are too sexy, basically. Books with what they call obscene and explicit material. They want these books yanked out of school. But here's the thing. The books that they're fighting, the books they want banned, mostly deal with LGBTQ+ issues. Books like Gender Queer Lawn Boy and George. And it's not just North Carolina. The American Library Association says it tracked 156 what they call censorship incidents around the country in 2020. This year, they've tracked 155 since June alone, right? That is a pace that has increased. Joining me now to talk about this is Katie Beck. So, Katie, let me start with a great to have you on the show, by the way. I think this is your debut appearance. We love having you. Let's talk about this criminal complaint.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, it's filed against the school district. We should mention the parents there say, we're not specifically targeting these LGBTQ+ books. They're saying that's coincidental, but they say they're raising complaints about any book that has graphic material. Talk us through these arguments and what the libraries are saying.
Yeah, parents are outraged, and they're basically saying take these books out of the school library, or some parents are going to take their kids out of the school district, Hallie. I mean, they say the images in these books are graphic, are sexually obscene, and depict things that are well beyond what kids in schools should be seeing in their libraries. Now, the American Library Association, as you stated, said they oppose censorship. They oppose censoring any opinions or ideas, even unorthodox ones, and they say that, you know, preserving this free flow exchange of ideas is what we need to preserve democracy. So they obviously are pushing back against parents, but we've seen this in multiple states. We've seen it in Wyoming. We've seen it in Florida. We've seen it in Texas. We've seen it in Virginia. And now we're seeing it in North Carolina. So while this fight is certainly not new, as you stated, those numbers are pretty striking in terms of how they seem to be going up.
So I have a follow-up on that, but help me understand this. A criminal complaint, criminal, like, does that mean there are potential criminal charges that the school district could face there? Does that even seem likely? I wonder what legal experts you're talking to are saying about that.
So there are 9 parents that have signed on to one criminal complaint, and it's sitting on the desk of a sheriff right now. He is not the ultimate decider of what gets prosecuted. The DA is, and the sheriff has been interviewed about it, and he said, look, I'm the one that makes the arrest once they decide if this is actually a criminal charge or not. At this point, we don't know. It's going to have to be decided on whether or not they have violated minor obscenity laws with these publications or not. So that's going to come down to the DA in that county. And as far as we know, it's not yet been decided.
And as we talked about, the American Library Association is basically saying, hey, like, this is, you know, we don't want to see books banned. Like, that is antithetical to the idea of literature that raises your consciousness on something else. But it does come at a time, Katie, as you talked about, we're seeing more and more parents, it seems, or at least more and more coverage, right, of some of these really contentious fights in school boards and related to education all around the country.
Absolutely, Hallie. I mean, during the election cycle here in Virginia, I was in Loudoun County. I went to those school board meetings and listened as 200 parents vented to the school board members. Then the outrage, was real. I think two things have happened. I think, politicians have now learned from, Governor-elect Glenn Youngkin's example in this latest election in Virginia, that this is a lightning rod issue, and you absolutely can mobilize and galvanize a base using parents and parental choice and curriculum in schools as a tool to do that. It was certainly the lightning rod in his campaign that gave them momentum to get them over the edge. I also think parents have realized that their voice carries, and that when they do express outrage at these school board meetings and they do really raise up in number, that they are going to get covered and they are going to get attention, and from politicians, from the media, or whoever else, that gives them a lot more say in the process. So there's a sort of a twofold exercise happening, both politically and from parents who genuinely feel like they have a right to have a say.
And that goes for parents, on both sides of a given issue. Katie Beck, great to have you. Thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it. Coming up here on the show, have you seen this? Alec Baldwin, not just on defense, but incredibly emotional over his role in that movie set shooting that killed a cinematographer. He's saying somebody's responsible, but it's definitely not him. So who is? We'll get into it after the break. Gun violence in Philadelphia has gotten so bad, it's already broken a record now for homicides in a year. Zinkley Esamwa is there to look into why this is. But first, let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, a former Arizona nurse who sexually abused and impregnated an incapacitated long-term care patient has been sentenced to 10 years in prison. That was the maximum for the sexual assault charge he pleaded guilty to in September. Number 2, the British Army is sending soldiers to help people in northeast England who are really struggling after a huge storm there. Thousands of people still don't have power after Storm Arwen last week. It's pretty cold there right now. Look at the snow on the ground. So you can see the Army personnel handing out hot water bottles. They're handing out hats, blankets, gloves, socks, all that stuff. Number 3, a federal judge has blocked a Texas law that would have stopped social media platforms from censoring users because of their viewpoints. The judge says the law actually violated the First Amendment rights of the companies. Number 4, more and more people, particularly people in the middle class, are heading to the dollar store for everyday items. Stores like the Dollar General have traditionally served lower income or maybe more rural shoppers, but new numbers show that over the course of the pandemic, and now with inflation up, they're seeing more foot traffic from shoppers with higher incomes. Number 5, Santa Claus is coming to town, or is he? Dramatic news lady pause. Across the country, there's a huge shortage of Santa Claus entertainers, companies that provide Santas for holiday events. They're apparently scrambling to meet high demand. So what's up with this? Where are all the Santas? Hiding in the North Pole because they're worried about COVID, apparently. There's been a real spike in violence in cities across the country. It's been talked about, it's been politicized, but it's very real in cities like Philadelphia. Right now, Philly has the highest number of homicides ever, 513 homicides this year. And remember, it's only early December. All of this violence is disproportionately affecting people in the city, the black population in Philly. We sent our Zinkley Esamwa there to look beyond the record numbers of the people and families affected by this. And a warning, some of this footage is really upsetting.
My mom got a phone call and she just broke down crying, and she came in and told us that Sam Collington was shot and killed.
Samuel Collington, a Temple University senior, killed Sunday in an attempted robbery. A vigil Thursday honoring the 21-year-old, renewing calls for change and accountability. The city of brotherly love now facing a nearly 12% increase in homicides from January 1st to late November. Homicide rates in Philadelphia continue to grow. This mural actually has the names of those killed or injured by gun violence over the years in the city. Most of those people are black. Specifically, 83% of those shot in Philly are black. Black people making up nearly 82% of fatalities. Among those killed this year, a pregnant woman and her unborn child shot after her baby shower. 14-year-old Samir Jefferson fatally shot 18 times this week waiting for a bus. And Evan Baylor fatally shot in June.
That is a pain to put your child in the ground that I would not wish on my worst enemy.
Baylor shot just outside his mother's home. This home.
Evan was outside and he was preparing to sell his car to a childhood friend.
Baylor never made it back inside. A triple shooting, leaving the 23-year-old and another man dead, and a 3-year-old shot.
My son was captain of the football team in high school. My son was a scholar athlete. My son went to Penn State. He did everything that he was supposed to do. He wasn't in the streets. He wasn't gangbanging.
Officials say city suspects are difficult to track, citing a need for comprehensive witness protection. But these homicides are not unique to Philly. The FBI reporting 2020 homicides up by the largest one-year spike ever, jumping nearly 30%.
The main cause of death, which has been, the case for decades, is firearms.
The Philly Police Department telling NBC they're on track to recover 6,000 crime guns this year.
I've never seen this many illegal guns flooding the streets of Philadelphia.
Johnson is on Philly's Special Committee on Gun Violence Prevention. Guns, a contentious issue for Philly lawmakers. A bill to allow concealed carry of weapons without a permit passed by a divided Pennsylvania House in November with mostly Republican support. On Thursday, that same bill vetoed by Governor Tom Wolf, who called it, quote, dangerous.
So you study crime, you study violence. How do we fix this?
These are long-term problems that require long-term solutions, that require long-term commitments, real commitments.
City officials now calling for an increase in investments in education and community programs.
We want to make sure we're supporting our young people and investing in them so they don't pick up a gun in the first place.
In a statement to NBC, the mayor's office saying it's acting, quote, swiftly, citing the state's multi-year violence strategy and anti-violence grant program. Mourners of all backgrounds demand justice.
There have been no arrests, and there's an ongoing investigation. So for our family, there's no closure. And for me, I, with every fiber of my being, am going to get justice for Evan.
And hope for an end to the violence.
I just hope he's remembered the way, like an Eagle Scout. He was just a good person. Everybody can vouch for that who knew him.
Zinkley is joining us now. Zinkley, it's such important reporting. I'm glad to have you with us. And let's talk about some of these numbers here, right? Because the mayor of the city is investing more than $150 million in violence prevention programs. That's coming up next year. That feels like a big number, right? Put some action to those. What does that look like for people in the community? Do you know what I mean? Like, what is that tangibly going to do?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that. And I asked the commissioner and council member that exact question. And they said they wanted to start at the cradle, right? By the time someone shoots a gun or is hit by a gun, it's too late. So they're saying they want investments in education. They want investments in mental health. A lot of these communities are seeing ongoing trauma again and again. So time will really tell. But the criminologist I spoke with pointed out this issue took time to develop, and it'll take time and more than money to heal.
In a lot of these homicides in Philly that we've seen, the person who pulled the trigger is just not found. Like, they're not arrested. They're not held accountable. I imagine that's really frustrating for people on the ground where you are.
It is. And I spoke with the mother of Evan Baylor, and she said, her son's killer has not been found. And one of the reasons, she says, there needs to be more witness protection. A lot of these folks are within the community. Sometimes it's social media beefs. And so they're saying if witnesses don't feel safe to come forward, if they feel there will be retaliation, they won't speak at all. And of course, we know there's tension between the black community and police as well. And that, of course, plays a part as well, Hallie.
Zinkley Essamwa live for us there in Philadelphia. Zinkley, thank you very much for being with us. By now, you may have either seen or at least heard about this really intense interview. Alec Baldwin sitting down with George Stephanopoulos saying he did not pull the trigger on the gun that killed cinematographer Halyna Hutchins. But that's not the only rather extraordinary thing we heard. He was asked if he feels guilty. Listen.
I feel that someone is responsible for what happened, and I can't say who that is, but I know it's not me.
I want to bring in our legal analyst, Danny Savalos, on that. So, Danny, Alec Baldwin is very clear on that point, but I want you to hear something else that he had to say, right? This conversation about how he says he didn't pull the trigger. Watch.
I'm holding that. I'm just showing. I go, how about that? Does that work? Do you see that? Do you see that? Do you see that? She goes, yeah, that's good. I let go of the hammer. Bang, the gun goes.
Baldwin had his finger outside the trigger guard, parallel to the barrel, and that he told me since day one he thought it was a misfire.
That was the lawyer we just saw there for the assistant director. So, Danny, if it's true, right, if what Alec Baldwin is saying is accurate and he never physically pulled that trigger, what does that mean for any culpability moving forward here?
Well, that if it's true is a major component, because you're going to have gun experts who are going to say that with firearms, it's impossible, even if you pull back the hammer on a single action, and this is a modern replica, that you still have to pull the trigger to discharge the gun. Of course, experts on the other side may say, well, it is theoretically possible. So that is a big question mark, even though Alec Baldwin may actually and reasonably believe that he never pulled the trigger. Maybe he doesn't remember. Could be any number of things, but that is a major question mark, and Alec Baldwin's mere recollection may not be ultimately controlling if, and this is a big if, there is a law enforcement agency still looking at his potential responsibility.
Explain that.
So, just because Alec Baldwin says, hey, I don't remember whether, or I did not pull that trigger, there may be evidence to show that, hey, with this particular gun, that's just not possible. In other words, because it's a single action, you pull back the hammer, and then you must, the only way for it to discharge is to pull the trigger after that. If that's true, then Alec Baldwin's recollection might be at odds with the laws of physics and the laws of how this firearm works. That being said, there's always the anything's possible realm, and anything is possible. And in this case, there are so many things that keep emerging, so many facts that add more twists and turns that it was complicated even before Alec Baldwin told America that he didn't pull the trigger. Now it's even more complicated. And by the way, you want evidence of that? Just go to social media. Look at all the people that don't believe him. There are plenty of people that do, but there are plenty of people that are saying things like, that's ridiculous. These guns don't go off unless you pull the trigger.
To this point here, we heard Baldwin go into, it seemed to me, really intense detail about the moments leading up to this. What happened? I mean, listen, he really didn't hold a lot back. If you were his lawyer, would you have let him do this?
Probably not, but I'm not second-guessing his legal team. You have in Alec Baldwin, one of the top 10 people able to express themselves. I mean, he's done it as an actor. He's done it speaking on political issues. I mean, this is somebody who can communicate. It's his job. So if, as a client, he wants to get out there ahead of the story, and he did apparently want to get out there that he did not pull the trigger, and that's a very important piece of information. He has to recognize, and his legal team surely recognizes, that there are going to be doubters out there, people who say, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I don't believe you anyway. That's going to happen no matter what. And as somebody who has lots of clients who are charged with crimes, they want to get out in front of the story. Sometimes the risk is just not worth the reward. Whether or not it paid off for Alec Baldwin remains to be seen.
Danny Savalas, thank you so much for being with us and for talking through the legal implications of that interview. Appreciate it. Okay, so hypothetical question here. If your house was infested with snakes, what would you do? Because one guy in Maryland may have gone a little too far. This video probably gives you a hint, but we'll tell you more about how they dealt with it. Plus, the Winter Olympics are coming. Janice McIfreira is in China with tonight's original, where COVID is just one of a bunch of problems that may end up hurting the games. The 2022 Winter Olympics are coming, and it's happening in Beijing, where officials are dealing with, frankly, a bunch of challenges beyond the pandemic. We are less than 2 months away as of today, so Janice McIfreira reports on this for tonight's original. But first, NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions, and a segment we call The Local. From our Midwest Bureau, an entire farming town in Montana had to be evacuated because of a wildfire. It started Tuesday, and firefighters thought they had the flames under control, but it flared up again yesterday. 24 houses and businesses were burned down, but luckily nobody was hurt. From our D.C. Bureau, listen, if you had an infestation at your house, if it was a bunch of snakes in your house, maybe you'd call an exterminator. One guy in Maryland took a very different approach when he discovered his house was infested with snakes. His solution? Smoke them out. Look at your TVs. Look at your screens. You can see how that went for this guy. It quite literally backfired. He accidentally burned his house down. It's going to cost him about $1 million. No humans were hurt in the fire. No word yet on how the snakes are doing. And from our Southern Bureau, kind of a weird day on the job for a plumber in Houston. He found 500 envelopes full of cash and checks behind a loose toilet at televangelist Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church. You might remember back in 2014, $600,000 were stolen from a safe at that church. So is this a missing money? Police are trying to figure that out. They still haven't said how much cash was found in those envelopes. I want to talk about today's original now. In-depth reporting on a topic we've been watching. And for this one, it's the Winter Olympics, just 2 months away. Is that bizarre or what? It feels like we just had the Summer Olympics. Now we have the winter because of the pandemic delay. And like we learned from those summer games in Tokyo not too long ago, Olympics in the COVID area are, to say the least, different. These games coming up in Beijing are going to be different, too. Human rights groups are urging people to boycott. Janice McAfee is digging into all of it for us. Watch.
Hey, Hallie, I'm in Chongli, China. It's in the mountains just outside of Beijing. It's where some of the freestyle ski and snowboard events are going to be held during the Winter Olympics. And a lot of preparations are underway here, obviously, to try and pull off the games during a pandemic. But COVID is not the only challenge facing these games.
With just a couple of months to go, villages, ski slopes, medal podiums, all the venues for the Winter Olympics are ready. Some of them getting a test run by athletes aiming to compete at the Games. The rules for these Olympics stricter than Tokyo. Athletes and officials are effectively walled off. They're taking daily COVID tests. Travel will be limited to official sites, and there's no interaction with anyone outside the bubble. Justin Downs has been advising national ski teams on what to expect.
These games are about athlete performance, and nothing about the performance of the athletes will be diminished by COVID protocols at all.
All members of Team USA heading to Beijing must be vaccinated. For a lot of athletes, COVID restrictions are just now part of the landscape.
I would at least like to have my parents there. Safety is the number one concern.
Nearly 3,000 athletes from 80 countries will compete. Unlike Tokyo, local spectators will be allowed here.
There are a lot of COVID controls that'll be in place to ensure there's distance between the athletes and any spectators who might be here watching.
But athletes and officials who've had an early taste of the bubble are worried about testing positive in a country with a zero-tolerance approach to COVID cases.
We were scared before to come here because you never know what will you find here. Now that we are here, everything works well, good, and everything is okay.
Yet the pandemic isn't the only challenge here, with human rights groups and some U.S. lawmakers urging a diplomatic boycott over China's policies in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. A diplomatic boycott would allow U.S. athletes to compete, but would bar a government delegation from going to the Games.
She's done it!
And that scrutiny has intensified with the outcry over Chinese tennis player Peng Shuai, a three-time Olympian, who disappeared from public view after accusing a former senior Communist Party official of sexual assault, only to reappear in 2 video calls with the International Olympic Committee, who said in a statement that Peng told them she was fine, saying they were using quiet diplomacy with China. The Women's Professional Tennis Tour this week announced it's suspending all tournaments in China, calling for a full and transparent investigation without censorship into Peng Shuai's sexual assault accusation.
Sir, do you support a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics?
Something we're considering.
Now President Biden says he's mulling a diplomatic boycott. Chinese officials dismiss any criticism and say they're confident China will host, quote, a safe and splendid Olympic Games. For years, the government has invested heavily to push winter sports here to ensure 300 million loyal fans for when the Games begin.
Chinese officials maintain the same position, that politics and sports shouldn't mix. China's got a lot at stake with these Olympics. The criticism is mounting, and there's less than 3 months to go before the opening ceremony. Hallie?
Our Janice McAfee reporting for us there from China. All right, let's get ready to party like it's Y2K, baby, because trading cards are back. And I'm not just talking about sports. Callan Rosenblatt is going to break down why these throwbacks are making a comeback. Do you have a bunch of old baseball cards just sitting around in your garage or your mom's garage or your grandma's garage you just can't bear to part with? I've got some really good news for you tonight. Trading is back. And you might be thinking, no, Hallie, I don't have a bunch of cards collecting dust in a garage. Well, guess what? You don't have to be into sports or video games for this. Musicians are getting in on this, too, because this is back in a big way. The Weeknd dropped his own rookie card a few weeks ago, made by the guy who created the highest-selling basketball cards to ever exist. And then you know this stuff is going digital, and you know if there's something trendy that BTS is all over it. They are selling NFT versions of trading cards featuring band members that fans can trade and sell. And oh boy, are BTS fans trading and selling. Callan Rosenblatt is here for us on this. So here's the thing, Callan, like trading baseball cards is a hobby that goes back for decades, right? We saw it kind of blow up in the early 2000s. After Pogs, you know, sort of became less of a thing here. And then we moved past it, right? Why is this coming up again?
Well, I think it's multiple facets, right? Like, first, as you mentioned, like the whole NFT thing, art, digital art, like these sort of the rarity of pieces. I think that's sort of like really coming into vogue right now, and it's just like super popular. The other thing is during the pandemic, people who had the extra income, and now not everyone had it, but who had extra income and they couldn't travel, they couldn't do a lot of things, they picked up new hobbies, and one of those hobbies was trading cards. And now the third facet of this is nostalgia. We have this major nostalgia movement happening right now where people are all about the 90s, and trading cards were really hot in the 90s, especially things like Pokemon cards, which are having a major moment right now. So it's a three-pronged answer. It's those three things that I think are the reason that these trading cards are having such a moment right now.
Talk to me about one of those prongs, right? Because the Y2K culture thing, a little birdie tells me that you just got a Tamagotchi, I think. I am old enough to remember Tamagotchis, although I'm still obviously very young and hip. That is like such a big part of this too, right?
Totally. Yes, I did just get a Tamagotchi.
Congratulations
I am a 90s
to you.
Kid. Thank you so much.
I'm really proud of you.
My puppy is now competing with the Tamagotchi. but Y2K is having a major moment, from butterfly clips to my arch nemesis low-rise jeans. Everything from the 90s is now new again. What's old is new again. So we're seeing all these older things sort of coming into vogue, especially among young people. Young people are currently, one study found, the biggest consumer of trading cards. And again, I want to harp on Pokemon cards. Those are huge at the moment.
Well, talk to me. Money. Put money on them. What are they like? What do you get from them?
So there was a Charizard, which is one of the rare Pokemon, a holographic Charizard that sold for $220,000 to the rapper Logic. And now that is like an original card. I know, it's crazy. It's nuts. And you could literally, Hallie, go on YouTube and watch people open packs of Pokemon cards and say, that one's worth $1,500, that one's worth $2,000, and just, you know, basically encourage their followers to invest in these Pokemon cards also, because they're making money and they're something nostalgic. They are having such a moment. They also just celebrated their 25th anniversary a few months ago, so that is also kind of why they're having a moment. But it's crazy. There's a lot of money here, and there's a lot of nostalgia, and that is making for a huge popularity behind these trading cards.
Okay, I have like 30 seconds left, so give me your crystal ball prediction. I mean, I brought Pogs up as like a joke, but like, what is the next trend, right? Do I need to get my slammer out and like get ready for this again?
You know, I think Pogs is like a really good guess. I think it's really hard to know. I mean, like, as much as I know Gen Z, I don't know where they're going to go next. They may ditch the 90s and they may go straight into like PS3s in the mid-2000s. It's really hard to tell at the moment, but I cannot wait to figure out what I have to buy next.
I'm really excited for you. Thank you. Please keep us updated and keep that Tamagotchi going. Callan Rosenblatt, always great to have you. Thank you. That does it for us this hour. Always a busy one here on Hallie Jackson Now. We'll be right back here Monday, same time, same place. Hope to see you then. More coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.